Super. So everyone will be trickling in here. Just going to wait a couple more seconds for folks to join us. And then away we'll go. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining our live virtual event tonight with Ryan Busse and Senator Jon Tester to discuss Gunfight, Busse's inside look at the American firearms industry. I'm Jessica from the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, coming to you from the ancestral unceded land of the Apsalaki Crow, Kootenai, Bitterroot Salish, Cheyenne, Shoshone-Bannock, Ochrady-Chacoan, Kalispel Ponderay, South Piikani, Northern Cheyenne, Chippewa Cree, Assiniboine, Aani-Gravant, and Dakota peoples, among others. We encourage those of you joining us from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its peoples. We are grateful to be here in this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common Northwest stores, Helena Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Visit booksincommonnw.com for more information and to purchase books from this series, and be sure to follow us on Eventbrite for more great Books in Common events. Before we get to the conversation this evening, I had just a few housekeeping notes. If you didn't purchase your book with registration, you can still do so. There will be a link in the chat, or you can just visit booksincommonnw.com and click on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store. Those links will appear periodically in the chat as we go through the evening. We are recording tonight's event, and it will be viewable on the Books in Common NW YouTube channel following the event. If you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or dropping them into the chat, and we'll get to them as time allows. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend first exiting and re-entering the webinar. If that doesn't work, you can find us live streaming on the YouTube channel that I mentioned. And headphones will usually fix sound issues. It looks like a couple of you might be struggling there. So if you just exit and re-enter and make sure that you've selected your computer speakers to be your audio. It is, with all of that out of the way, it is my very great pleasure to introduce our guest this evening. Ryan Busse is a former firearms executive who helped build one of the world's most iconic gun companies and was nominated multiple times by industry colleagues for the prestigious Shooting Industry Person of the Year award. Busse is an environmental advocate who served in many leadership roles for conservation organizations, including as an advisor for the United States Senate Sportsmen's Caucus and the Biden presidential campaign. These days, Ryan provides consulting services to progressive organizations with the aim to undo the country's dangerous radicalization. He remains a proud outdoorsman, gun owner, father, and resident of Montana. And you can find his book, Gunfight, here at Country Bookshelf or at the links in the chat. Jon Tester is a third-generation farmer and a U.S. Senator representing Montana. A former elementary school music teacher, he served on his local school board before running for and serving 2 terms in the Montana Senate. He and his wife, Charla, operate the same farm near Big Sandy, Montana, homesteaded by Tester's grandparents more than a century ago. The Testers raise organic wheat, barley, safflower, lentils, millet, alfalfa hay, and peas. Elected to the Senate in 2006, Tester serves as chairman of the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee. He is also a member of the Senate Commerce, Indian Affairs, Banking, and Appropriations Committees. So without further ado, gentlemen, please take it away.
Well, thanks, Jessica, and thanks everybody for being on this call. We're going to get right to it here. I first met Ryan Busse 15 years ago. I was running for the United States Senate. Nobody knew who I was at that moment in time, and I was told I needed to beat this guy up in Kalispell that worked for a gun manufacturer. And the description that was given to me about Ryan Busse is he's pretty conservative, but he's got a good head. He's a good thinker. And so go in and pick his mind and, find out what his recommendations would be for you to do to win a United States Senate race. And that's exactly what I did. I went into the gun manufacturing company that he was the head of in Kalispell. And we sat down and we had a nice visit about everything, actually, not just firearms, but everything. And it was a great conversation, and I want to thank Ryan. There's a lot of people that took credit for my win in 2006, but Ryan, I only won by 3,562 votes, but you played a role in that. So we want to thank you for that. So let's take a step back and tell us kind of where you came from, how your values in your life were set up, and how did you get involved in the firearms industry?
Well, thanks, Senator Tester. It's a really honor for me to be here and for you to be hosting me tonight. And thanks to Country Bookshelf and for all of you who love independent books and are book readers. We have far too many of those far too few of those in the country today. So let's generate more of those. So I grew up. John and I actually share quite a bit of upbringing. I grew up on a high plains wheat farm, and with a father and a grandfather and a great grandfather who were dirt farmers. I was a dirt farmer through most of my and ranching kid through most of my youth, and I grew up like a lot of kids on ranches and farms. I grew up with a rifle in one hand and a shotgun in the other. To me, guns were just part of being on a ranch, part of being a rural kid, part of hunting, and frankly, they came to represent for me so much of what is good and true about being, I guess a flyover country kid. I worked hard. My dad worked hard. My grandfather worked hard. My brother worked hard, and we didn't get a lot of time to do a lot of fun stuff. But when we did that fun stuff, a lot of times it involved guns. Like we pheasant hunted and we bird hunted and we tried to deer hunt. And so many of the best times of my youth were centered in and around guns. And they became for me, like a lot of people in America, sort of symbols of what I wanted to be true and I wished was true, and sort of the best times of my life. And so when I graduated from college, I really wanted to be a professional baseball player, and I only had a few problems with that. Not the least of which is I didn't have a fastball anywhere close enough to good enough to do that. So that was kind of out. I thought about being an attorney, and my wife now advises me that I would have made a very good attorney, and I don't think she means that as a compliment. But sort of my in the hip pocket was this idea that I might live out another dream and sort of be in and around these things that were, sort of symbolic of the best parts of my youth. So I got into the sporting goods industry and the firearms industry, and I went to work for a gun company. And we were lucky enough to establish that sales and marketing office in Kalispell. That was in 1995. And that's how it all started.
So in your book, getting right into it, you address a lot of the issues that are around the NRA. How many years were you in the gun industry? How many years did you work?
Well, I worked for Kimber, which is the company I helped build. I worked for 25 years and 4 days there. I worked for about 3 years at an optics company named Burris before that made spotting scopes, rifle scopes, binoculars. So all told, about a little over 28 years I worked in the shooting sports industry.
So you watched the NRA evolve over those 25 years. Like when I was going to school, the NRA did hunter safety classes. That's what they were known for, is hunter safety, teaching kids how to respect a gun and use it in the right ways, and being a sportsman, advocating fair chase, all that good stuff that they did, and they did it very, very well when I was in grade school and high school. I'm assuming that when you first got in 25 years ago, had they morphed into something other than that at that moment in time?
Well, so I tell a story in the book about my grandfather, who grew up during the Depression, was in the military during World War II, went through the dirty 30s. Literally, I don't think the guy, understood what hardship was. Everything was hardship. And to my grandpa Clarence, the NRA represented something that was very healthy, and he was a proud FDR Democrat. And to him, the NRA represented the things that you mentioned, Senator, camaraderie, safety, sort of patriotism, but in a very healthy way. And so that proud FDR Democrat, his favorite hat that he wore to my high school football and basketball games was that big black NRA hat with the gold block letters on it, right? To him, in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, that the NRA still meant those things. I remember as a kid, my father was an NRA member, and we got the NRA magazines mailed to our house. And they most often reference things like, shooting competitions in Port Clinton, Ohio that had been hosted by the NRA since 1907, or how to clean this gun, or how come the old Winchester lever action gun was such a good gun. Like, these are articles that my brother and I read. Like, I never read anything that showed up at our house about the impending doom of the democracy, or why QAnon theories were to be believed, or any of the stuff that we see now. And I did live through, I started in 95, and I think the NRA had started to morph into what it is now, which is this really unbelievable, it's weakened because of its own malfeasance now, but it's really let this really powerful force loose upon our country, which is largely what the book is about. And I think it had started to change in 95, but none of us in the industry really knew that. And then these really ugly, opportune times for change hit our country. And I think the NRA, rather than decide to be a part of the solution for our country, decided that it was going to be a part of the problem. Columbine hit, and there were, many of you may have seen the news today, there were some very secret tapes that were released today of insiders in the NRA, where they literally decided, okay, we're going to do what's politically expedient, not what we think is good. And they did that after Columbine, and they did that after Sandy Hook. You and I share some history with Sandy Hook. They did that after Parkland. They did that after so many of these horrific events. And I think the resulting politics and division and hatred and fear that we now live with in our country is the result.
So, I mean, there's people do things for a reason. Is it all about the money in this particular case? Were they doing it just to enrich themselves? Why more from an organization that just they did good things? I mean, I got to tell you, the NRA for me was an organization that they taught you gun ethics. They taught you to respect the weapon. They talked to you about it being a tool that you use for making, be able to feed the family. And it wasn't, and to protect yourself ultimately if that had to be, but it wasn't the first option out of the bag when a problem arose. So was it all about money? Is that what the deal is? They were going to make a bunch of money off this, or what?
Well, I think a lot of times in this country, we give too much credit to agencies and people and organizations like the NRA as if there was some grand plan. I actually don't think there was a big grand plan. I think that this was stumbled onto accidentally. And I think what happened was that the NRA, through its marketing company, which is based in Dallas, named Ackerman McQueen, they figured out that, holy smokes, the same thing that can be used to drive short-term election gains, meaning if we just forget about what the country is in a year or 2 or 5 from now, let's just do whatever we can to light the biggest fire right now to get the most people scared we can, just so we can win the very next election. We'll worry about the mess it creates after that. That became politically expedient for the NRA in sort of these accidental ways. And that's why it ended up adopting conspiracy theory, which I go into extensively in the book, using fear to drive voting patterns, which I go into extensively in the book, accepting, if not promoting, some pretty ugly racist stuff, which I go into in the book with, as I say, I've got the receipts. And it just so happened that accidentally, those are exactly the same things that drive short-term gun sales, and not in the healthy way you're talking about. But if we all put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's very fearful, if we think, if I get fearful enough, if I'm not a gun owner, I will run out and buy a gun. Like, you scare me about a mob coming down the street, or America's first black president, or whatever. Like, if you think up conspiracy theories to scare me, you can get me to buy a gun and you can get me to vote. So the NRA stumbled into this voting technique of using fear and conspiracy and hatred to drive voting patterns. And it just so happened it also drove short-term gun sales. And neither one of those have proven to be the most healthy things for the country.
So I've gotten to know you pretty well over the years. And one of the things that crossed my mind as you were answering that question was, here you got a gun executive that worked for a successful gun manufacturing company, a very successful one, I might add, that decided to basically tell all about what's going on in the industry. And it might make somebody think that Ryan Busse is anti-gun. Could you talk about that for a second? Where do guns? What kind of role do they play in your life right now? Do you consider yourself anti-gun? Do you still hunt? Do you still take your kids out hunting? Do all that kind of stuff?
I think I might be more pro-gun than I've ever been. I hunted 2 days ago. I take my boys beg me. I just told my young son Badge that the book opens with my son Badge, named after the Badger 2 medicine. Told him I was going to go elk hunting in a couple of days, and he was begging me to take him out of school to go elk hunting. I was antelope hunting with him. I mean, for God's sake, we shoot in my front yard, literally shoot pistols in my front yard. I've sold a couple million guns. I've been nominated for the largest awards in the industry, and I'm not in any way anti-gun. I am anti-radicalization with guns. I am anti-responsibility or non-responsible gun ownership. I am anti so many of this sort of dangerous, irresponsible activities that are centered around guns. That's really what my book is about. And frankly, I'm dismayed that something that I think is a very important part of Montanans' lives, my life, my dad's life, my brother's life, my son's life, my family's life, has been used to radicalize so many people and to center such a dangerous political movement in this country. I'm worried that guns may be at the center of what brings this country apart. And I think gun owners, we are a responsible lot. We're supposed to be a responsible lot. We should be at the center of what repairs this country. We should be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And I'm worried that the forces that have used guns to radicalize so many of our fellow citizens are going to try to use guns and gun owners to take apart the country. And I think we need to be one of the main things that puts it back together.
So a lot of questions are flying through my head, and I'm not a journalist, so they bounce in, they bounce out. But where do you see this going? I mean, now let me back up a little bit further than that. You talked about your granddad being an FDR Democrat. My granddad was too, so we do have a lot in common. You also talked about him being a very, very proud gun owner and proud of being an NRA member. There's been accusations over the last 5-6 years that the NRA is an arm of the Republican Party, and in fact has gotten money from the Republican Party to put forth that agenda. And look, opinions, everybody's got one, and do you see it that way? Do you see him as being having a political agenda to help Republicans and to try to destroy anybody else that's maybe running for office?
So now I get to tell a story about the guy who's supposed to be hosting and telling stories about me. In 2012, I'm gonna get to the answer here, Senator, but you can probably guess where I'm going. In 2012, the country experienced what I think, not numerically, but what I think is the most horrific mass shooting event that we'll probably ever see. Las Vegas was terrible from a numeric standpoint, absolutely horrific. But when we saw, 20 little innocent kids in a grade school in Connecticut be killed by a guy wielding an AR-15, that was pretty horrific. And just about everybody inside the gun industry thought, okay, we're finally going to see some policy change now. And Joe Biden at the time was vice president at the time, was enlisted to try to put together some sort of policy advancement. I tell this story in the book. And eventually LaPierre basically told everybody at the White House, after meeting with the White House, they initially were open to it, and then they ended up telling everybody to screw off, just because I think they figured out they could score political points. The whole thing got whittled down to what was called the Manchin-Toomey Amendment. And I know some of you who watch the news may have heard of this guy named Joe Manchin. I don't know, I hear of him once in a while now. But he was one of the co-sponsors with Pennsylvania Republican Pat Toomey. And it was a very, very modest proposal. All it was a proposal to shut the gun show loophole that remained open ever since Columbine, which had happened 1999, whatever, 10, 15, 12 years earlier, right? Very modest proposal. And I ran into you, Senator Tester, at the Democratic event in Helena, and that bill was being considered, and you asked, how do you think I ought to vote? And I said, well, from a policy standpoint, it's a good policy standpoint, but just a day or two earlier, the NRA had decided, instead of supporting the bill, which they had told everybody they were going to score it. And what scoring means to anybody who doesn't follow politics like Senator Tester and I do, is that they were going to use it as a way to essentially mark your political record. Even though they told everybody they were going to be in support of it, they decided we're going to score it. And that meant if you voted for it, you're going to forever bear that mark of being an enemy of the NRA. And if you voted against it, you would receive, credos from the NRA. And when I explained all this to Senator Tester, who at the time I think had a drink of whiskey in his mouth, he held it there for a while, and then he said, well, this isn't about me. This is a pro-gun bill. I met with those parents, and it's the hardest thing I've ever done. And I thought, he's right. And then you went on to tell me you're going to vote for it because it was the right thing to do, even though we both knew that it was going to be used to mark you. You believed it was a pro-gun vote that you were going to make, and you didn't really care about the political games anymore. You did that, and a few months later, I went to the NRA convention, and the two most powerful lobbyists in the nation were waiting for me at the edge of my booth before the NRA show started, Chris Cox and Jim Baker. And they tore into me because I had been an ardent supporter of yours. And they told me that Tester had screwed the NRA and that he did the wrong thing. And I told them, well, Tester actually gave me a message, and he said it's about time people do the right thing. Cox stormed off, but Baker stood behind. And Baker told me, he goes, I warned him if we ever become just a bought and paid for wing of the Republican Party, we'd be screwed. He actually used a different word, and I'd use a different word in the book. But who knows, we might have a polite audience tonight. But I told him, well, Jim, it's too late. You are screwed. So not only are they a known bought and paid for wing of the Republican Party, they know it. They admit it. They consciously made the decision. Their only goal is not to advance good policy, not even to try to debate good policy or to be slightly partisan. It's to be 100% partisan. It's all about trying to mark good people on the other aisle. It doesn't matter how much they agree. And if, for those of you who don't know, John Tester was an NSSF industry, the gun industry legislator of the year, and yet he still is marked by the NRA for doing something as common sense as voting for the Manchin-Toomey Amendment, which is a bipartisan amendment. So that's a long story and a long way around of saying yes, it's absolutely all about politics.
So speaking of politics, the Attorney General here a few months ago for Montana joined a suit. I can't remember exactly. Joined a suit on bump stocks. Do you remember this, Ryan?
Yep.
Bump stocks was what was used in the shooting in Las Vegas, and
over 500 people, by the way.
Yeah, and I've had a hard time figuring out what the value of bump stocks were, other than for the use that the dude in Las Vegas used them for. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of is that to appease the NRA? Is that why he did that, or do you think that's what Montanans want, or what do you think is the thought process behind something like that?
I personally don't. I have a lot more respect for the people of Montana than Austin Knudsen does, apparently. I think that Montanans believe in responsible gun ownership, but the Montanans that I knew, the people that the sorts of people that I grew up with, I believe that if we have a Statue of Liberty on one coast, we really need to have a Statue of Responsibility on the other coast, right? Liberty without responsibility is a dangerous thing. I think that Montanans understand that full well. That's the sort of responsible existence that we know is necessary to maintain the sort of democracy that we all want to live in. There's this dangerous movement afoot now that is controlling the far right and our Montana Attorney General called Second Amendment absolutism. Second Amendment absolutism essentially espouses that there should be no restriction on firearms, none, ever. Like, apparently, we should have 8-year-old kids with howitzers in the playgrounds of our schools, right? They believe there should be no restriction whatsoever. And so this, suing to prevent the restriction of bump stocks, this idea that we should have no permitting, that we should have no checks, that background checks aren't to be enforced for sales. I mean, what responsible gun owner wants the bad guys, wants irresponsible people to have guns? Like, no people that I know of. But because I think this politics that the NRA started and that is so prevalent on the right now and that I fear is in danger of really scarring this country in very dangerous ways, is it started a little bit like a campfire. So a few people said, oh gosh, this is sure nice. Can't we stand around this and stay warm? And then they woke up in the morning, they're like, uh-oh, it's dry and the wind's blowing. And now this thing is raging across the country, our state, our attorney general, and nobody can put the thing out. And they don't know what to do with it, but they're just going to keep fueling it. And that would be fine if our democracy were not at stake, if the lives of citizens that we all care about were not at stake, and if basic responsibility is not at stake. I think all of those things are at stake, and I think guns, sadly, are right in the middle of all of it.
So you've referred to it a bit, but background checks.
Yeah.
Background checks are set up to make sure that criminals and terrorists and folks who are court adjudicated mentally ill don't have the right to have a gun. It's taken away from them. So that's kind of goes against the absolutism that we just talked about. There was a Republican, I'm not going to throw him under the bus, that said, if we don't do something on background checks, then the pendulum is going to swing too far and law-abiding citizens potentially could have their guns taken away. That's not where I want to go, because quite honestly, I still utilize my guns to control vermin and to protect myself. And the question becomes, do you see it that way? Do you see that this pendulum could swing so far that it actually could truly backfire and law-abiding citizens could lose their rights because the NRA is pushing this too far, just too far?
Absolutely, I do. I think, so an illustrative story for me, a couple of months ago, the sort of darling of the right and the NRA, Tucker Carlson, made a visit to Hungary, to what is essentially a dictator in Hungary, Viktor Orban, and praised Viktor Orban and Hungary as a sort of system that we want to emulate here in the United States. And Tucker's comments were something, and I'm not going to butcher him very much, I'm going to be very close. He said, since the Democrats have taken over Washington, D.C., people are more free in Hungary than they are in the United States. Now, the stupidity and lunacy of that are so far reaching that, like, if we had another 6 hours, I don't think we could figure it all out. But importantly on guns here, to your point, in Hungary, which is apparently this place that Tucker Carlson and the NRA want to emulate, almost nobody can own guns. A few roving bands of right-wing thugs that Orban says can own guns. That's it. There is no Second Amendment. There is no dirt farmer in central Hungary who controls vermin and protects himself with his pistols. That doesn't exist. So, as you told me about the Manchin-Toomey Amendment, this is a pro-gun bill. The NRA decided to present it as an anti-gun bill, but being responsible gun owners is a pro-gun thing. It is a pro-Second Amendment thing. It is a pro-American thing. Irresponsibility is not pro-gun. It's not pro-Second Amendment. It's not pro-American. So yes, I do fear it's going to go too far. Do I think those people in January 6th had any inclination of ensuring that the rest of the populace had the Second Amendment? No, I absolutely do not. I think that they would gladly overturn the Constitution to institute whatever sort of dictatorial system they want to institute. And we won't be worrying about any amendment. No amendment will matter. First, second, third, none of them will matter if that happens.
A friend of mine called me today, and I called him back, and then he called me back. He actually is probably on this call. He said he was going to be on this Zoom call. I'm going to quote him. He said, "This is culturally one of the most important books that have been printed in the last 20 years." It was a very short conversation, so I couldn't ask him why.
Yeah.
He's not somebody you know, Ryan. He's a friend of mine. But could you tell me why he would come up with that opinion that this is one of the most culturally important books in the last 20 years?
I will tell you, I don't know this guy, but I sure do like him.
He'll probably drop you a note.
So the through line of this book is that if we want to make our country any better, look, we've all lost friends. We've probably got family members we don't talk to. Our workplaces are divided, all because of this like ugly division and schism that runs through this country now. And I don't have to tell anybody on the call, it's freaking ugly. It's distressing. People worry about Christmas dinners and can they still invite Uncle Bob and Aunt Susie, because like this is not the America we want to live in. I believe that if we're gonna get back to the America we want to live in, if we're gonna repair this, we got to understand how we got here. And I firmly believe that I was in the kitchen that cooked all this stuff up. And I think if we're going to undo it, we got to understand what the recipe was, and we got to understand where it went in the oven and all this stuff. And all of the components of this ugly toxicity that we have in our politics today were really manufactured, developed, put on steroids by the NRA and the firearms industry, and then handed off to the political right, who put them on ever more steroids. And so conspiracy theory, hatred of the other, allowing, I know so many good people who aren't racist in their heart, but they forgive racist activity. They're okay with it. I saw that in the firearms industry. I don't believe that so many people that I worked with, they didn't wear white hoods. They weren't racist. Talk to them. They weren't racist, but they looked the other way at racist things. They forgave hateful things. We're not a country, and worse, it's gotten to the point now where half of the country dreams of killing the other half, and they're armed to do it. We are dangerously close. We are armed to do it. I hear it all the time. We're in a cold civil war, and I know there's a fair amount of people that want a hot civil war. Charlie Kirk event down in Idaho just about 10 days ago, the Turning Point USA, the youth event, a guy stands up and says, "When can we start using our guns?" And then people cheer, and he says, "I'm not joking. When can we start killing people?" Like, he was serious, and you could tell the guy was well armed. As Maya Angelou said, when people show you who they are, believe them. We need to start taking this seriously. We need to address it. We need to get it out in the open. We need to understand how we got here, and then we need to set ourselves about reversing it. And we're not going to reverse it by just like guessing how we got here. I'm telling you, if you read this book, you'll understand so much more about Uncle Bob and Aunt Susie or whoever you were worried about inviting over to dinner. And then you might understand how you go about reversing some of this stuff.
So if you were to talk to leadership of the Democratic Party right now, what would you tell them that they need to be aware of when it comes to the issue of guns? Because quite frankly, there are some in the party that I belong to that really think that guns should be banned. There are others that feel exactly like I do, and you do, Ryan, that guns are important to us. What would you tell the leadership of the Democratic Party in relation to guns and politics and elections? And take it wherever you want to take it.
I think first, guns are far more important to the cultural identity of most Americans than many, not you, and not so many other Democratic friends that I have, but that some national Democratic leaders believe. I know it's easy to look at a chart and say, oh gosh, only what 13% of the people hunt, or whatever the number is, right? It's easy for political pollsters to dismiss gun owners or guns as sort of some ancillary thing that happens off in far off places that I don't care about, right? If you're some coastal elite. I don't believe that to be the case. I think that guns represent something they're very much like, I see Senator Tester's drinking a beer. They're very much like beer. They're very much like apple pie. They're representative to so many of us of what our culture is. So I say, first off, start understanding that guns are representative. Not all guns and gun owners are evil. Believe me, I've had, I think we talked about just before we hopped on here, the response to this book from gun owners has been, to me, honestly, humbling and overwhelming. Yeah, I've got a little hate. Most of the things I've got have been unbelievable love from surprising sources. Right of center gun owners, centrist gun owners, like, thank you so much. I'm a gun owner, but I'm not that kind of gun owner. We have allowed, as gun owners and as Americans, for a tiny slice of these people that have stolen the mic to set the agenda and define the rest of us. We have to take the mic back. And so I say to National Democrats, this is an immensely important cultural issue. You should not dismiss it. You should not run around attacking people's culture, because guns are important to people. They're important to people like me. I hunted with my dad. They represent things I want to be true. I wish to be true. It's not always rational. Like, a gun is a hammer, right? It's a tool. It's a screwdriver. Not really. Senator Tester, an auger is a hammer. Last night before you went out and hauled your wheat, did you say you lay down beside your auger and think, oh gosh, I can't wait till I use you in the morning? No. But people do that with their guns, right? They have an emotional connection to them. So I think National Democrats need to understand that the guns are a symbol for so many people across the country, and we need to be respectful of that. They're serious. There's irresponsible things that are happening with them, but we're not going to fix that irresponsibility until we can respect good, responsible people that want to do the right thing.
Yeah, man, I'm just going to tell you what, you sound like my dad. I hate to tell you that, Busse. You kind of look like him too. He was bald. Also, but
this is by choice. This is by choice, by the way. This is a haircut by choice.
That's good. I'm going to tell you that the worst beating I ever got was the time I went out and shot a bird because I could. You just don't do that kind of stuff. I got one more question, Jessica. Can I ask one more question before you?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so you got a bunch of regular folks on this call, good people that are interested in enriching their lives through reading good books. What advice would you give to average people to roll back the radicalization that we've seen, so Martha and George can sit at the same Thanksgiving table?
I think we need to welcome everybody in, but I think really good, polite people have been taken advantage of. And I've seen it in my own family. I've seen it in my former workplace. I've seen it with so many other friends. And so we need to start standing up for what's in our best interest. And it's not in our best interest to have a friend or somebody pop off with a QAnon theory about sex slaves in a pizza parlor, or, friends of ours killing kids in some cult, or whatever other crazy conspiracy pops up. Because I can tell you, I've lived in a place, I saw what happens when we allow that, or when we look the other way. For instance, I think, Wayne LaPierre sort of tried this out. He said, well, Barack Obama is going to rewrite the Constitution. He said this actually at an NRA convention. I think he was sort of like trying and thinking, well, he might get shouted down. And people cheered. And he's like, well, holy crap, that was a lie, but it worked. It looked like it motivated people. And it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. And when that ran out, they had to come up with ever more insanity, ever more craziness to motivate people. And we see the same thing now in our friends and relatives, where the first conspiracy starts and we don't say anything, kind of like, well, oh gosh, it's just Uncle Bob, let it be. No, that's not okay. We need to have them over. We need to have them for dinner, but that doesn't mean you have to look the other way when crazy conspiracies and hatred are espoused. You got to figure out a way to stand up. I mean, my way to stand up is telling the truth of my life and writing this book. But there's ways we can do it. We just have to push back and insert rationality into our conversations and our lives and our friendships and our families. It's not okay to let this stuff pass.
All right,
Thank you.
Jessica. Thanks, Busse. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this. But you go ahead and take it, Jessica.
Thank you.
Wonderful. One of our first questions is, do you think those who need to read your book will? In other words, how can your book influence others and other opinions?
Well, everybody who writes a book wants everybody to read it, right? So I hope so. I think that certainly for Montanans, the themes in this book will ring very true. And it's a book about me and my family, sort of the narrow lens of me and my family, but the wide lens is on our country. And the book sort of alternates between what was happening to me and my life in the firearms industry, and then it pulls back and looks at stories like the one I told about with Senator Tester and the Manchin-Toomey legislation. That was a larger thing that was happening and very illustrative for our country. And it goes back and forth. And so I will just say that for those of you who haven't read it, or you're thinking about maybe giving it to your friends or your family or whatever, it's something that will explain an awful lot of what you've experienced in Montana and across the Western United States with so many of your friends and relatives and so much of our gun culture. You'll understand a lot more about why we're here and about how we get out of it. And so I certainly hope that everybody reads it.
And just as a bookseller over here, it is remarkably readable. Like, you sit down to read your chapter for the night before you go to bed, and then it's 4 hours later, and you really ought to get to sleep because you got to wake up in the morning. So I highly recommend, if you haven't grabbed it, there's links in the chat to purchase the book. Sally wants to know if you have any tips. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on an earlier answer about what can an ordinary citizen do to push back against the NRA? Like, do you have tips for how to talk to Uncle Joe, who is throwing around strange things at Thanksgiving?
I think one of the things that I've realized and that I point out in the book is that so many good, responsible gun owners are pawns for this larger political force that really doesn't have anything to do with guns. It has to do with money and political power. And so people who are in this and who believe they're doing it for guns and believe that guns are going to be taken, those are all concoctions to make you do things against your own self-interest. And we've seen so much of that. Once you believe your culture is under threat, you will do almost anything. You will sacrifice all of your self-interest to protect that, as long as you stay very fearful about that. And so I say to, in this case, air quotes here, Uncle Joe, do you really think it's in your best interest to allow yourself to be wrapped up and be a political tool of an organization that just wants you to be fearful of something that's not going to happen? And I found that actually to be quite effective, because a lot of these people really don't like to be pawns for larger political forces. They really don't. And there's lots of examples in the book of how that happened. I mean, this is not conjecture. These were very conscious decisions made by the NRA to just keep ratcheting up the fear and conspiracy. So they keep people like Uncle Joe very fearful of what's going to happen. But it's not based on any rationality or factual basis. I see a question here from Julie. I think that one of the things we haven't talked about here so much tonight is, my book opens with a protest here in Kalispell where my family and I went into that protest, and my son Badge was attacked by an armed protester. And Badge, I do have a son that would be very unwise to attack, because he's 6'4" and about 240. But Badge at the time was 12 years old and weighed about 75 pounds soaking wet. and this armed Second Amendment patriot decided to just start, poking him in the chest and screaming at him. And it certainly felt like to me at that time, I was not armed, but I had worked in the gun industry at that time for 25 years. And I thought I saw the sort of product that my industry was developing right there, this crazed guy who would do anything for guns, even like threaten a slightly built blonde 75-pound kid, right? And it felt at that moment as if matches were being waved right over the gasoline. And at any instant, the gun could come out, people could die. There were 1,000 people that protest, and there were probably 100 to 150 heavily armed men there, who it felt like to me were just dreaming of how they were going to use those guns that they had on themselves. And that just violates every sort of responsible gun behavior I've ever been taught. And I think if you need proof that this sort of radicalization in and around guns has gone way too far, I know this happened in many towns across the West, across Montana, across the United States. I think there's documentation now of well over 1,000 of these in the last 18 months, culminating in what we saw at the United States Capitol, where you had a couple different types of flags. You had political flags and American flags, and then you had come and take a AR-15 flags, right? So guns are square at the middle of our radicalization. And it's because very powerful political forces have put them there.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie. Let's see here. I had another good one. Do you think a responsible NRA or an alternative to the NRA might emerge?
I hope so. I've been asked that a lot. I hope we get to a place and a political culture where good, responsible, policy-based, rational organizations that care about the future of the country can. I think we've got a few things to fix in our country before we get there, because I think, again, we now have a political system and an economic system that kind of worries only about the next quarter, only about the next election. Everything in the future is sort of, well, that's be damned, right? We're just like, what can we do to maximize everything for the next thing, the short-term thing? And I hope that we're about ready to take a breath and realize, nothing really matters if we don't have a country here in 2 or 3 years. So I hope we get to that point.
Thank you. Kristen says, I am a public school teacher here in Bozeman, and I had to participate in run, lock, fight training to know how to resist in case an active shooter came in our school. How do you think preparation for these worst case scenarios reinforces the sense of inevitability around gun violence?
I think Kristen makes a really good point that we're currently accepting a normalization of firearms radicalization and horrific outcomes with firearms that we don't have to accept. Directly answering her question, I think it greatly increases the feeling of inevitability about gun violence. And I don't think we'd have to do that. We're doing that because it's a conscious decision, because we're not making other conscious decisions to reduce it instead of increase it. And we can make conscious decisions to make the country better. We don't always have to make these decisions that make the country worse. And we've been making or just avoiding making far too many good decisions. And things like simply closing the gun show loophole. And I believe that we should have a national ban on open carry intimidation. I think that needs to be instituted across the country, because I don't think we should normalize this sort of gun radicalization. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for any of us. It's not healthy for gun owners. It's not healthy for our democracy.
Roxanne says, you mentioned that you've received a lot of support from gun owners, which is great news. I saw your op-ed in the Montana newspapers about House Bill 102, I believe. Any ideas on how to influence the Montana legislatures and organizing gun owners? Sounds like an approach.
Absolutely. Yes, I was in opposition to House Bill 102, and I didn't get a lot of love from the firearms industry about that particular position that I took, oddly enough, because I opposed permitless concealed carry and forcing college campuses and bars to allow firearms on their premises. I was labeled as some sort of apostate when all I'm doing is trying to stand up for responsible gun ownership. I think that, again, I think responsible people generally are just way too polite. And the people who have the mic now really don't give a damn about politeness. They will get up and scream and yell and make themselves big, right? Just like a basketball defensive player who stands up and holds his arms up really high. He makes himself really big because he wants to seem bigger to the other team than he really is. Well, that's what's going on with these crazies who have influenced the Montana legislature to make them believe that none of us want any responsibility in our firearms policy. That's just insanity, and a fair amount of that is on us for not being for not taking the mic away from these people. Again, the reaction I've got to the book indicates to me that there's an awful lot of people who feel the same way that I do. I think sometimes when we get in political environments like this, we think we're the only ones left in the room. I can tell you, we're not the only ones left in the room. There's a lot of us.
Which is a heartening feeling, I think. Why aren't there more prosecutions of gun owners who are clearly outside the law?
I think there needs to be strict. I think there needs to be strict prosecution of firearms owners that break the law, including, and frankly, why there is, I think there's a myriad, or why there aren't more prosecutions. I think there's a myriad of reasons, but there aren't even nearly enough prosecutions of people who it's illegal to try to purchase a gun when you know illegally when you don't pass a 4473, which is the federal NICS, the background check system, and we don't prosecute those nearly enough. So it's not, I don't sit here thinking that we need to, or espousing that we need to pass a myriad of laws. I think largely our problem is cultural. I'm sure there are laws, legislation that needs to be passed, or things like House Bill 102 that don't need to be passed. But largely our issue is cultural, and we need to focus on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. It looks like that might be the last of our questions, but I do have a comment that I want to share with you. Maggie says, not a question. I just want to make sure you guys see this. Thank you, Ryan, for the book and for this rational perspective and for tramping around and telling the story. Tester, you're just the best. I'll keep sending money and you keep being our guy.
I got a quick one, Jessica, if I might.
Yeah.
As long as you got a few minutes.
Sure do.
Look, I was in DC on January 6th. I saw what happened. Totally something that was totally out of the realm of being legal, quite frankly. And there's been a lot of folks that have talked about what transpired on the 6th. I can tell you that I visited with one of the Capitol policemen that said that they were outgunned, they were outnumbered. He even said that, the folks that they took to the ground, 3 out of every 4 had guns in their backpacks. You don't hear that on the national news. You don't hear people talking about that. But it does show how bad the police were outgunned on the 6th. But that isn't the question. The question is, do you think January 6th was tied to the NRA in any way and was tied to gun politics in any way?
Well, it was indirectly tied to both of them. Directly, I hope we find out if it was or was not. But the NRA has been pushing this sort of fear and conspiracy I saw it. I tell stories about direct stories in the book of essentially it's been encouraging people, be ready for the time when you have to overthrow the government to protect your rights. Be ready. The government's going to take everything from you. Whether they had direct involvement in it, whether we're going to find out through hopefully a very detailed investigation of the degree to which any of it was coordinated by entities like the NRA, I don't know. I hope we find out. But I can tell you that sort of action. I took a call just a couple of days after January 6th, Senator, from somebody who I worked in the firearms industry with for quite a while. And there was a joke on that phone call that said something like, well, at least the American public knows what it's like to be at an NRA convention now. That was the words that were uttered to me. Those people did not look unfamiliar to me. The sort of fervor in their eyes, those come and take it flags, none of that stuff was by accident. Was it directly mapped out? I don't know. But it was certainly indirectly mapped out, has been for the last 15 years. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
All right. That's all I got, man. That's all I got.
You got wheat haul. Heck, you're probably going back out and starting up an early morning haul here pretty quick.
We got lights. Yeah, we do.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening and for sharing Gunfight with us. Again, be sure to grab your copy. You're going to want to gift it to your whole family so that you can have this conversation. And 'tis the season after all. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Senator Tester, so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of our viewers, and be sure to follow us on Eventbrite and countrybookshelf.com for more great virtual events.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for everybody who's been on the call and all you great book readers. Read more. Thanks.